First plants that are in bloom kind of for each season. So if you think it's disorganized at the end, just tell me, because I couldn't think how to do it. So anyway, so is beekeeping for you. You have to like nature. You have to like being outside. It really makes you aware of the weather, the amount of rain you have, the plants that are in bloom, and I don't know. It's like I've always wanted to have a herb garden, but I never have. But it's just kind of one of those things that all of a sudden you're aware of what's going on outside of the world around you. And so that makes it really nice. You also have to be willing to work hard. There are two kinds of beekeepers, those with bad backs and those who will have bad backs. So it's a lot of lifting, and we'll talk about that and some different things you can do if you have issues. So, and I think it's really important to continue learning. I mentioned that I started bees before Varroa. Well, beekeeping has changed so much in the 45, almost 50 years that I've had bees, and it continues to change all the time. Just the world is more mobile, and we get these different things in from other countries that we never had before, and it's just always changing. And so if you do get bees, I really want to encourage you to join your local bee club, maybe take one of the national magazines, and just kind of keep abreast of what's going on, because it's like anything, you can never learn too much. So, honeybees are social insects. They live together in colonies. They're real cooperative in their brood care. So, if you think of a beehive as one big organism, like the beehive. Instead of a bunch of individuals, they more work together as a group. As the needs in the hive, if the needs in the hive change, the jobs of the different worker bees change. And so that's really, really interesting. There's only one fertile individual in the hive, and that's the queen bee. And we were talking earlier, honeybees in the olden days didn't typically die off every year, but now that seems to be a little more typical with some of the problems bees have. But there are some things you can do to get them through the winter, and we'll talk about some of those things. Honeybees have 3 body parts. They have a head, they have a thorax and an abdomen. The head has the eyes, the antenna, their mouth parts and that sort of thing. The thorax has their wings on the back, and that helps them with their flight. And then the abdomen is all their organs, and their stinger. So, there's 3 types of bees in the hive. They're called castes. There's the queen bee, the worker bee, and the drone. And we'll talk about each of those. The queen is an egg-laying machine. She just really doesn't have many other tasks in the hive other than to lay eggs. She also produces chemicals called pheromones that are spread throughout the hive all the time. Within 24 hours, every bee in that hive has either touched the queen or touched another bee that's touched the queen. And this spreads her pheromone or her scent around and lets the bees know that everything's okay. We have a queen. We'll keep on going. And so that really helps. She always has attendants around her. Who are always feeding her, taking care of her, and that sort of thing. That's really important. Now you can kind of see this white thing coming out of her back in there, and that's an egg. It looks really big up here on the screen when you're trying to look for them inside a beehive. They look a little smaller, but that's really important. You don't always see the queen when you go into a hive, but sometimes if you can see eggs or really young larvae, you know you've at least had a queen bee in there in the last 3 or 4 days, so that's really important. You'll also notice that the queen has a dot on her back, and maybe you've seen that at the state fair and their observation hive or something. Actually, every year is a different color, and this year, I think, is blue, but it's kind of hard if you're colorblind. Some people are colorblind to blue, and you can't always see them. But every year is a different color, so the beekeeper knows that that's the queen they put in there, and they'll know if it's been replaced or something like that. But sometimes the bees will chew that color off. But so that's put on by the beekeeper. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Be sure and don't be shy. Tell me when I have the microphone over here. So yeah. The queen structure, she has many tasks that, many body parts she doesn't have that worker bees have that we'll talk about in a minute. She doesn't have a long proboscis. That's a long, like tongue-like structure that the bees use to go down in the flowers to get the nectar. Because she doesn't need that. The bees are feeding her. She doesn't go out to the flowers to get nectar and pollen. So she doesn't need that. She doesn't go out and collect pollen, so she doesn't have little things on her legs where the bees go out to the flowers and collect pollen. The queen doesn't have that. She does have a stinger, but she only uses it to sting other queen bees. She doesn't use it to sting people or worker bees or anything like that. So worker bees have a stinger on them that has a barb, kind of like a fish hook on it, and so when you get stung and you pull the stinger out, the stinger stays in you. But the queen bee doesn't have that, because when a worker bee gets stung, it actually pulls the inside of the bees out because of that stinger. And so if a queen had that, she would die if we pulled out her inside. So she has really, really large ovaries, and her spermatheca can hold 7 million sperm. So she I'll talk about this when we get to the drones, but she goes out on a mating flight once a year after she's about 10 to 14 days old, and she flies out to this congregation area, kind of like a singles bar, and she'll mate with 10 to 15 drones on that mating flight. The drones die when they mate with the queen. She comes back to the hive, and unless the hive swarms, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that's the only time she leaves the hive. So she has enough sperm in her that'll last however long she lives, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So the worker bees perform most of the tasks in the hive. They're infertile females, so they aren't able to produce brood in the hive that will actually survive. From the moment they emerge from the cell, they get busy. Their first job is to clean out their cell. They're actually, when they emerge from the cell, they're actually adult size already. The younger bees work inside the hive, and that's because when they emerge from their cells, their bodies are still kind of soft, so their bodies haven't hardened up so that they can actually use their wings to fly. So after 4 or 5 days, when their bodies have hardened up, they're actually able to fly at that time. And then it's the older bees that work outside the hive. Some of the jobs in the hive are dependent upon what the bees need right then, so that's really important. I should say worker bees only, people say you're working as hard as a bee. Worker bees only live for 5 to 6 weeks. So they work so hard during that period of time that they actually just wear themselves out. They'll wear their wings out, and they don't live very long, except during the winter. And since there isn't as much work to do over the winter, they'll actually live for the several months of winter that we have. Another one of their jobs is they have glands in their heads that actually feed the larva. So the queen will lay an egg, and you see that white stuff around this? That's brood food, and the worker bees have actually produced that, and they eat a high protein. They make a high protein food out of the pollen that they're able to feed the larva with, and that's really, really important. And so as a hive develops, early in the spring when there's a lot of dandelion flowers and that sort of, a lot of food out for them, that's when they're building their hive up and they're the strongest. And they have a lot of food coming in, and so they're able to produce really strong hives at that point. Another one of their jobs I mentioned is to take care of the queen. That's the younger bees. And again, they're always touching her, cleaning her, feeding her. She really doesn't have to do a whole lot except for lay eggs. So the bees that go out to the flowers, they aren't the ones that store the honey down in the cells or the ones that store the pollen down in the cells. Foragers or older bees go out to the flowers. They'll stick their tongue down in the flowers and get nectar. And while they're doing that, they also get pollen on them as they go from flower to flower. And that's how they pollinate. And they have these really hairy bodies. And they'll have these combs on their hands. And they'll comb the pollen. They put it down in their baskets. They have these little baskets on the back of their legs. And they'll mix that with a little bit of honey, and then when they get back to the hive, other bees will help them store those down in the cells, and I have a picture of that further on. It also enhances their communication. So they have a special honey stomach that isn't part of their digestive system, that as they go out to the flowers, they store the honey in a little storage tank instead of storing the honey as part of their digestive system. So I mentioned as they go to the flowers, they pack this pollen in their leg. They pack it down with their heads. When we go into our hives in the spring when the dandelions are in bloom or the henbit is in bloom, the bees will have these golden heads from the dandelion pollen or red heads from the beautiful purple henbit and that sort of thing. So it's pretty neat. So, and then they have these specially developed pollen collecting features that I think are just fascinating. And you can see as they put the pollen down in the cells, sometimes you'll just look in a frame and it's all these different colors because they've been to so many different kinds of flowers that they've packed in there. Certain bees get really proficient at working certain flowers. Different flowers have different kind of mechanisms for getting pollen and nectar out of them. Bees who have been working alfalfa flower kind of hits them on the head and kind of pisses them off. So sometimes when they've been working alfalfa, that hive is kind of mean. So all the different flowers are just developed differently. So it's pretty interesting. They also have wax glands on their tummies that they can build wax, and that's how they build out the cells. Do some of you kids have a place on you that builds wax out? Do you build wax? No. Does your mother ever use a Q-tip on your ears? We don't produce beeswax, but we do produce wax. So we'll talk about beehives later, but as this is a plastic and it's impressed with a cell, hexagonal cell. That's plastic with a wax coating. And the yes. And let me get that. This is kind of brittle. But this is a frame from a honey super, and you can see that the bees have actually built that and they manipulate the wax with their feet and with their mouth parts. So, yeah. I mentioned communication. Well, bees don't actually talk, but they communicate through dancing in the dark inside the hive. So they'll come back to the hive with a load of nectar, and as they give the nectar to another bee actually has a tongue that goes down into that special honey stomach that the bees have, and they draw that honey out, and then they put it in a cell. The same with pollen. They'll take the pollen back to the hive. Another bee will pack that pollen down into the cell. They'll also tell bees, especially in really hot days, bees will use up to a gallon of water in a day. And so some bees, that's their job, is to go to the pond or your swimming pool or your whatever and get water. They'll bring it back to the hive to keep water going. But they actually do dances, and they orient towards the sun when they're telling the other bees how to find the nectar source or the pollen source or the water, and that's a really important form of their communication. I mentioned the drones. The drones mate once with the queen, and they go out and die. And I should say that the drones in this hive aren't going to mate with their queen. They'll go to this drone congregation area, and they'll mate with queens from other hives so that they're not mating with their own queen. The drones are kind of like not, except for mating with queens, they're not very important to the hive. They don't do any work in the hive. They don't go out and get nectar. They don't go out and get pollen. They can't feed themselves. The worker bees have to feed them. They have really specialized eyes so that they can find queens. They have these really square bodies. They look pretty strong, I guess. I don't know, but they have broader wings. Their antennas more specialized, and they mature to mate at 12 to 13 days of age. So. I know when I first started beekeeping, people would always say, oh, you got drones in your hive. That's not a very healthy hive. But actually, drones in a hive are a healthy hive because they are part of a hive needs to have some drones in it in order for it to feel healthy. If we have a really dry summer, there aren't very many flowers. In the fall, late fall as it gets towards winter, the bees will actually push the drones out of the hive because they don't want them in there over the winter eating the stores of food and that sort of thing. And so they are really important to the hive at certain times of the year. So sometimes you'll go up to your beehive and there'll be drones kind of crawling around. That's because the worker bees won't let them back in. So. I mentioned the picture of the queen laying an egg. Well, the honeybee actually goes through a metamorphosis right inside that cell. So all this on the outside for you to see actually takes place in the cell. It's an egg for 3 days, and then it goes into the larval stage. And each type of bee, the worker, the drone, the queen, takes a little different developmental time. And then it goes from the pupal stage, larval stage, on into the pupal stage, and on into the adult stage. So as you look down in here, I mentioned that sometimes you'll go out to your hive and it's really hard to, rarely do you see the queen. I know sometimes it's a goal to see the queen, but so usually as you go out through your hive, if you can see eggs or larvae, if you can see eggs, it's kind of a miracle because sometimes it's really, the light has to be perfect, your eyes have to be really good. Some of us have those little flashlights like you get at Harbor Freight that we keep with us, so we can look down in the cells so to see an egg. So sometimes if you see an egg or you see just the really young larva and a little bit of larval food, again, you'll know you've had a queen in 3 to 4 days, and so everything's okay. So, but that's, and then the older larva is real well fed with that white brood food. And then the emerging adults, they actually will just kind of chew their way out of the top of the cell. This cocoon-like thing is the bees. It's made out of beeswax, and it's really important. Keeps the bees warm during that time of year when it's growing. The worker bees, even in the winter, even in January and February, if they have just a little patch of brood in there, they keep the temperature about 96 degrees all year round. So in the summer, they act as little air conditioners, and they'll be out in front fanning and keeping the hive cool. And then during the winter, they actually cluster real close together on top of the brood. And they kind of do a little shiver motion this time of year, where just the bees on the inside next to the brood are warm, and they just kind of change places. And they'll be right by the brood and by food, so that the bees are always changing place, especially this time of year when it's cold. So this is a frame of brood, and the different bees have different size cells. So this that's kind of flat here, that's the worker brood. They're a little smaller bee than the other bees in the hive. And then this in the center that's kind of pushed out a little bit, that's the drone. The drones are bigger than the worker bees, and so it's just a little bit bigger. We kind of call it bullet-shaped. I don't know. It kind of has a round head on top and sticks up a little bit. And then this cell here is actually a queen cell or a swarm cell. So this hive has gotten really, really strong, and that queen pheromone that I mentioned earlier isn't being spread around very well. And so they're raising a bunch of queens. And what happens when they swarm is the old queen goes out with the swarm, and they leave some queens who are virgins back at the hive. And the first queen that emerges will go along and sting the other queen so that she's the only one left. And then in about 10 days, she'll go out on her mating flight, and then that hive becomes her hive. And the old queen and half the bees that have flown off in a swarm will start a hive in another place, like the eave of your house or a tree or something like that. So you can tell this kind of looks long like a peanut, a little longer, so. So it takes them 16 days for them to develop a new queen. So say you're out working your bees, and I've done this before. You pick up a frame and you don't have a good grip on it. So you set it down to get a better grip on it. Well, you just killed your queen. Yes. So I think this is so interesting. So the worker bees, to raise a new queen, it takes them about 24 hours to figure out, well, where's that old lady in the hive? She's gone. We need to do something. So they take a worker bee egg and feed it this same high protein food that they feed the larva, only a little higher protein, called royal jelly, that the bees make in these glands in their head. And they feed this worker bee egg this really high protein royal jelly. And this worker bee egg then develops into a queen bee. And that's called a swarm cell. And actually, it looks similar to this, but supersede yourself, sorry. They've superseded their old queen. So it looks like this, but it's more up in the body of the frame where the swarm cells are down at the bottom and the supersedure cells are up at the top. So your queen's getting old, they'll do a supersedure cell and raise a queen the same way. So. The worker bees, it takes 21 days for them to develop, and the drones take 24 days. So. I mentioned how queens and drones mate. So. And again, the only time the queen will leave the hive after that mating flight is if the hive is swarming. So now we're going to do beekeeping through the year. Does anyone have any questions about my short little biology thing? Yes? It probably had a queen. She had a swarm in a tree. Did it have a queen? Typically, a hive will leave with the old queen, but sometimes they're still really strong, and a swarm will take off with a virgin queen still. And so after a beekeeper catches them or whatever, they get settled in a hive, then the virgin queen will actually go out and mate and comes back. So I know when we've caught swarms and put them in a hive before, we'll usually wait, 5 to 7 days before we go back and look for for eggs and larvae and know that everything's okay. So. To get them all took them several days. Mm-hmm. So, yes.
I have two questions. First of all, here at St. Anne's, we're going to have a second hive. Now, we've hopefully established our first hive. So, is it possible then to have a second queen really fairly close to the first hive?
Mm-hmm. We typically, we have some hive stands, and we'll have 2 hives just with a couple feet in between them. So that's pretty normal to have a couple hives right close.
Tell me that, but it makes me nervous. And the other thing is, we want to put a window in the second hive so that the children can look in. How realistic is that?
Well, Stuckies used to do that, wasn't it, Stuckies on the highway? The only thing is typically the beehive is dark, but people keep observation hives in their houses all year round. The only thing is you don't see much on the outside frame. It's, sometimes there'll be a few bees and some honey, but you won't really be looking into the interesting part. But you know what? It's neat to see the bees, so I don't know. What do you think? Are you for it? I think you could try it.
Why not?
Yeah. If it doesn't work, the next year you knock the glass out and you put wood in. But yeah, I would use plexiglass or something like that. But I've known people who have kept bees inside and had, 4 or 5 frames of glass, and the bees do just fine. So worth a try. Any other questions? Okay. So you wouldn't think there's much going on this time of year, and I mentioned how the bees clustered together, and food is really critical. We went out last Sunday when it was kind of warm before the Chiefs game started, and looked in some hives and determined that a few bees needed some food, and so this week we fed a few bees when it was a little bit warmer. But pretty much all year there's kind of a little bitty patch of brood, whereas in April there might be 10 frames of brood or 12 frames of brood in the hive. So.
What's the typical loss through the winter,
Percentage-wise, what's a typical loss through the winter? Well, in the 70s when I started keeping bees, if you had 10 hives and you lost 1, that was a big loss. Now we're happy if we only lose 50%. 50%. If we lose half, we're happy. And it's because of varroa mites, and we're going to talk about that as we get on. But yes, beekeeping has changed. So when the temperature drops to 57 degrees inside the hive, the bees start to cluster. And I mentioned that they keep the cluster between 90 and 96 degrees, no matter what the temperature is outside. And they also don't keep the whole hive warm. They just keep that area right where the bees are. And so a lot of beekeepers worry about keeping the whole hive warm, but bees have a way of dealing with that. So then we consider early spring to be when the dandelions start. And that's when the bees start bringing in pollen and nectar. The weather's warmer, the days are a little longer. And the day length stimulates the queen to start laying more eggs because the bees will be able to take care of more brood. So, actually, right now, some of the elms and maples have started producing a little pollen, which is, you wouldn't think about it, but, another month or so, the beginning of March, the pussy willows will start having a little pollen on their trees. And then this is that hen bit, the bane to farmers, but we have a friend who always says, it gets my heart to pumping when the hen bit's in bloom, because that to us really signifies the beginning of the spring buildup, because it's like everywhere and it produces pollen and nectar and is really good for getting the bees going in the spring. So also towards the end of March and early April, the red buds and the crabs are in bloom. They produce nectar and help with the spring buildup. You can see all these different colors of pollen. That's all the different plants produce different pollen and produce different tasting honey. And I mentioned that that's a value-added product. Some beekeepers actually collect pollen and they'll sell it at their farmers market or to health food stores. A lot of people, it's actually a food. It's the protein for the bees, the pollen is, and then the honey is their carbohydrate, so that they eat. So this is a great picture of a frame. And this is kind of how a frame is set up, how the bees set the frame up inside the hive. There'll be pollen across the outside edge. Honey. This is sealed honey up here. The bees have sealed the honey with beeswax. And then there'll be a layer of pollen underneath the honey, and that's so that the pollen food will be close to them. And then the queen lays right below that. So this is her brood. This is, I keep mentioning brood, but I haven't shown you what brood is. This is the brood or the bee babies that are going to emerge. And then this is the eggs and larvae. And that's just such a beautiful frame of what it would really look like inside of a hive. And so those of you thinking about getting bees, the best time to get bees is in April. Because as you grow as a beekeeper, getting used to your hive, you're going to watch your hive grow with you. And so it'll start out as a small hive, and then as you get better and not as scared of beekeeping, your hive is going to grow and get stronger as you get stronger in your beekeeping skills. So there's a lot of food beginning in April. The weather is warming up. This is a great picture of a swarm. That's one way people get started. If you're interested in catching swarms, that's a pretty cheap way to get started in beekeeping. You can let the fire department know, the park and rec department know that you're interested in a swarm, and they'll let you know. They'll give you a phone call when someone calls them and says, I have a swarm hanging in my tree. And then you'll want to say, what have you sprayed it with? Because maybe they've already sprayed it with something. You'll want to say, how high up is it? Because you'll need to know if you need a ladder or a shotgun to shoot the branch off. But so there's some good questions you'll want to ask first. And you'll also want to know if it's hanging outside or if it's inside their house. So another reason to get started early in the spring is there's more brood and bees inside the hive. And beekeepers are going to want to manage their hives for swarm control. As you think about a location for your hive, you want to have some things in your mind. One is, can you get to it every year? Some years are dry, so it's easier to get to places. Can you get to it all year in a wet year like we had last year? We actually had one hive. We got stuck down in there, and it was awful. We have that AAA where they have to come off road to get you, so anyway. But you also want your bees to be in full sun with just a windbreak. You want to have water nearby, a pond or a stream, a river, someone with a water garden or a bird bath. You want to place your hives outside of the path of where your kids run or your grandkids run and your dogs run, though dogs do learn quickly, as do children, to stay away. So we always have Brittany's, and our first Brittany, oh my God, every bee that would fly in front of it, he'd snap at it and eat it, and he'd shake his little head as he got stung, but it never stopped him. One of our favorite things to do in the spring is just to drive around and see where different flowers are. Where is the clover blooming? And that sort of thing. So that's really important. A lot of beekeepers will plant pollinator gardens, that sort of thing. So you also want an area where there aren't cows or horses, and if there are cows or horses, or buffalo, someone mentioned buffalo around here earlier, you'll want to put a fence around your bees that's easy for you to get into, but keeps the cows and horses out. Cows will just rub against it and knock your hive over, but I don't think the bees bother them. But horses freak out, and so you'll want to, if you have horses, you'll want to protect them. So. And also, if you live in town, you might want to check with your ordinances. Sometimes you can't have bees, but sometimes they just need to be X number of feet from your property line, or something. Sometimes there's some guidelines you can follow to. Ideally, you want morning sun, a little late afternoon shade, a windbreak on the north, and your hives facing east or south. I mean, that isn't always possible, so. And then what does the hive consist of? So typically around here, we'll have these are called hive bodies, these bigger boxes, and they're heavy. These will weigh 70 to 80 pounds when they're full of honey or brood and bees. So that's why I said at the beginning, I think it's nice to have a partner to work with. I mean, my husband and I usually work together. And while I typically let him do most of the lifting, by the end of the day, we're working together lifting those hives up. So we also try and keep an extra hive so we can move it over. We're not bending down so far. And that really helps too. But yeah, these are heavy little boogers. So we have 2 hives. The bottom 2 are hive bodies. And that's typically where the queen is with her brood and everything like that. And then we use what's called a honey super. Or this is a queen excluder, sorry. And this keeps the queen from going up into the supers. And the super is an extra box that goes on, and this is where they put their honey in. And so as we'll take this off and take it back to our hive, to our house, and extract this honey, and these frames have had honey in the past and been extracted from. But some people who are older, or maybe a woman or someone that can't lift, or just someone with a bad back already. Some people will go ahead and use everything in this super size, and they'll typically around here have 3 honey supers, would be about the same as 2 brood boxes, and they'll start like that and then use their queen excluder and have empty boxes. This box weighs about 35 pounds when it's full, so it's not, it's half the weight. It's a big deal. So a lot of people, when they start, and some people will just start with 1 hive body and then maybe have 2 supers. So typically you don't take this bottom box off very often, and so you could get by with 1 and then a couple supers as your brood chamber, and then supers. So there's some things you can do if lifting or weight is a big deal for you. And it used to be most new beekeepers were elderly, but now, all this with pollinators and all that, we really are seeing a lot more young beekeepers, which is, it's really exciting. So the other thing that's really important is when you there's a lot of different types of feeders. This is when you first get your new bees. You'll want to get some type of feeder. And so this is called a top feeder. We love a feeder like this. It would go on top of your hive bodies. This will hold a couple gallons of sugar syrup, and you'll actually feed your bees in the spring to get them nice and strong before the honey flow. And so some type of feeder is really important. This is an entrance feeder, and it'll go in. You put a quart jar or a half-gallon jar. That works pretty good. So, but a top feeder is really a nice way to go. Some other equipment you need is you have to have a smoker. We like a stainless steel smoker with this guard on it. Pretty easy to grab it and burn yourself. So, and that's a real nice one. You typically burn, we like to burn untreated burlap bags in it. You can buy from the bee supply dealers some pressed cotton pellets. Those work pretty good. Usually in the spring, we'll go through our jeans. It's hard to find women's jeans that don't have spandex and stuff in them now, but Cecil's jeans are 100% cotton, and it's about the only way I can get rid of some of them is we cut them into little strips and we burn them up. So, and that works. So yeah, 100% cotton works really good. You don't want to use wool. Wool really irritates the bees. In fact, you probably don't even want to wear wool pants or anything out there. I don't know if there's something with the smell of it or whatever, but. What do you do with the smoke? Well, that's a really good question. When the bees smell smoke, it instinctually triggers some kind of mechanism in them where they'll kind of fill up with honey, and they won't be as apt to sting you. So I don't know if it's, some people say they think it's a forest fire. Well, I don't know what they think. But instinctually, so when we go up to the hive, and for some people, keeping the smoker lit is the biggest challenge in beekeeping. So you'll go up to the hive, you'll give them a few puffs of smoke, and as you work in the hive and you have your hive open, sometimes we'll just, smoke them around the top every few minutes. It kind of makes them go down a little bit, and don't get as agitated and as apt to sting you. So it has a calming effect for them and you. It does. I agree. And yeah, usually smoking is my job, but I don't know, we've kind of worked it out through the years, who does what, and Another important tool is, this is called a hive tool. It's a little pry bar. Bees stick these frames down with wax. They also gather something from the trees called propolis, and it's actually a sap they get from the trees that they manipulate. They'll coat the inside of the hive with it, and it is sticky, gooey, messy, and a hive tool really works. So I don't know how people who aren't beekeepers survive without hive tools at home. We keep one in the kitchen. I get something stuck on the tile, I scrape it up. So I don't know. We think it's important. So it also has a little thing in you can pull a nail out with, that sort of thing. So what else? And then the other thing is clothing. And I always say you should wear as much clothing as you feel comfortable in. We have friends who just raise high holy heck if they see someone wearing gloves or different things, but you need to be comfortable. The only way you're going to get in that hive is if you're wearing as much protective clothing as you want to wear. Now, some people might want to just wear a hat and veil, but there's full suits with veils that are zipper veils that are on there. There's, like coveralls. There's jackets. We have a screen suit called a bug baffler that Cecil and I like to wear. But I guarantee when we go out and we're pulling honey and the bees are flying around and aren't very happy, we're wearing a full suit. So you need to do what you feel comfortable with and don't feel intimidated by what anyone says. We also really like to wear, I don't think I brought any, but oh, yeah, I had a pair of gloves somewhere. Oh, here. You can get these leather gloves with a gauntlet on them. Those are really nice. But we've gotten so we like to just wear those thicker nitrile gloves. And I don't know, everything's just so gooey in there that they keep your hands clean. But we really like wearing those. And the bees will still sting through it, but it doesn't hurt quite as bad. So. I'm sorry? How do you treat a sting? I meant to stick a slide in about that. Well, when you get stung, the stinger is still in you, and so you want to take your fingernail and scrape it out. You don't want to pull it out. If you pull it out, you're actually squeezing more venom into you, so if you scrape it out, you'll get a little less venom in you. And I swear every time, so that's part of my bee sting treatment. And I will say, after almost 50 years, it still hurts the same. But early in the spring, I'll kind of swell up a little bit, but I don't swell up like I used to when I first started. I think your body kind of gets used to it. Sometimes people will be taking some medications, and sometimes medications will make them have a reaction. If you get stung and you start feeling like you're going to pass out, and that's another reason to have someone with you. You just don't know. We had our club sponsors some military families with bees, and this was his second year. He'd been stung several times. He'd actually started taking some different medications. Cecil was over there one day. The guy started having an allergic reaction. They called 911, and he was in the hospital for a day. So, sometimes you just have an allergic reaction. A normal reaction, it swells at the site. And if you get stung on your face and your eyes swell shut, that's a normal reaction. It just is awful getting stung anywhere near your nose or your eyes. You cry, you start tearing up. That's a normal reaction. But if you start breaking out in hives or you start having trouble breathing, you need medical attention. So. Let's see, any other questions about equipment before I go on? I had another little slide with the cost. Let me see. The other important thing is bees. How are you going to get your bees, and what do they cost? And we'll talk about that in a second. So I kind of estimated, depending on what kind of suit you get or clothing, a hat and veil's about the cheapest. but bees are about, a package of bees are about $160. This is a package of bees. This comes with 3 pounds of bees and a queen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there are a couple other kinds of bees you can get. The beehive, like I show here, is about $250. A book on bees, a beekeeping class. I would really encourage you. The local club, the Midwestern Beekeepers, or we have a group that meets in Lawrence, Kansas. They each meet once a month. They both have a really good bee class in the spring. Join your beekeeping club. By the time you buy a new pickup truck for your new adventure, a new house in the country with acreage, that sort of thing. So, and then an extractor. There are some plastic extractors that are about $100, but I suggest you not throw your money away on that. But if you're going to buy an extractor, go ahead and get a stainless steel one, and I think that's really important. Also, the clubs or some people, like you might have a friend who will let you extract when they do, so that this probably isn't an expense you need to do. But I know our Northeast Club rents an extractor out to people for $25 for a weekend or something like that. And several beekeepers could even use it, during that weekend or something. So. And getting started. So this is how I mentioned. I love when new beekeepers start with a package of bees because, like I mentioned before, you grow, as your beehive grows, you grow and you watch your hive grow, and I really like that. So this was my backyard. I used to live in Overland Park, about 91st and Neiman, and the way my yard was configured, I had to have the bees pretty close up to the house. And I had 2 dogs, and they learned pretty quickly to take the go around the perimeter of the yard instead of coming right in front. My dad was terrified of bees. He could not ever believe that I was a beekeeper. And one year we had a picnic in my backyard, and he was out there. And Dad said, well, I'm surprised you don't have any bees in the backyard. And they were like 12 feet from us, but none of us said, yeah, Dad, no bees in the backyard. And it's like, how could you not see those? So, anyway, not an outdoor person, so he didn't have a clue. So I mentioned choosing a good apiary site. When you get your package of bees, you want to make sure and have your equipment already put together. It's very important. Cecil and I have sold package bees for 32 years. This is the first year we haven't done it. And he would go out to California or Texas and pick up a load of 900 to 1,000 packages of bees that we would sell to other beekeepers. And and how many people would come and try and buy their equipment that day. All the pieces come knocked down, so you have to put them together. So you can't decide the day before you need to get equipment because it takes time to put it together and paint it. So taking care of your package when you get it, you want to keep it in a cool, dry place. Some years we get them and it's pouring rain the day you come pick your bees up, and so you just want to keep, heat will kill them. So I've had people who have put pictures on Facebook. I got my bees in the living room in front of the fireplace where it's warm. It's like, no! Keep them out in the garage where it's cool because the heat will kill them. People are crazy. So, and you want to keep, it comes with a can of syrup, and so you'll want to kind of keep lifting it up to see if you can feel that there's something in there. And if not, spray some sugar syrup on them, or with a paintbrush, paint some on the screen so they have some food. So, and the first step is you're going to want to have your hive painted and ready. And you also get an entrance reducer when you buy your hive, and you'll want to put it on the smallest entrance right at the beginning because till the bees get oriented and get all set up. It'll keep other bees from coming in and robbing them, or till they kind of get their little organization going. And that'll be down in there, so you'll get that all set up. Then you want to have your bee suit on and have it zipped up, and have someone check to make sure you have it zipped up. So, and ideally you'll want to install them either late in the evening or early in the morning when it's cool. And when you're completely ready, you'll continue. I'm going to set this down for a minute. You're just going to start with one box. You'll take a few frames out in the center. And so your package is going to come with a can of syrup and a queen cage. And inside this cage will be a queen. And when you get packages that have come from California, it's a little bitty thing, and all that's in here is the queen. If you get bees from Georgia or Texas or someplace else, sometimes it'll be in a larger cage. But they'll usually all have this little tab on them, and you can tape it or something. But you'll stick this queen down between two frames with the screen out so the bees can get to the queen and feed her and take care of her. And that's how they spread the pheromone around too, so that they know they have a queen. So you'll put your queen in, and then you'll spray these bees with a little syrup to kind of keep them from jumping around and flying around. You'll take your can out, you give it a good whack, and then you just dump them in, just like that. You'll just dump them in. And in really just a few minutes, they'll settle down and they'll start crawling up on the frames. Yes, ma'am?
What happens if your bees do not accept your queen?
If your bees do not accept your queen, so you're going to go back in about 4 days and you're going to release the queen yourself. And if you take the queen cage out and you see she's dead, first you'll want to look in your hive and see. Sometimes the package bee people will actually shake a queen in from the hive they're getting the bees out of. So sometimes you have a queen in there and then they're going to kill your queen. So you'll want to look for eggs or larvae and see if you see anything. And if not, you call the person that you got your package from and you say, my queen's dead, and they should give you another one. So then you'll put her in for another 4 days, let them get used to her, and go over it again. Because sometimes they'll kill a queen. Maybe she wasn't mated very well or something like that, and they can kind of sense that. So yeah, so then you're going to go back in 4 or 5 days, and there's actually a cork on one end. And if you're very brave, you'll take a frame out and you'll lay it down, and you'll have a nail with you. Don't try and dig it out with your hive tool, because it's not going to work. Have a little nail with you. You'll pry that cork out, and you'll just set it down, and you'll let the queen walk out. So sometimes she'll fly up in the air, and you'll go, oh no. But if you just stand there still for a few minutes, she'll usually just make a loop, come back, and settle down. So if you leave your hive open for about 10 minutes, usually she'll come back and settle down. So then you're going to close it up, put your frames back in, push them close together. And during this time, you're feeding them, and you'll feed them a sugar syrup. And so that's really important, because they have this, we pass this frame around, And they have to build all this wax out. And so you need to be feeding them until they. But you'll go back in 4 or 5 days after you release the queen, and you'll be looking down in there, and there's little eggs and larvae. So it's pretty exciting just to see your hive grow like that, I think. This is one of our youth scholarship students. There's the queen with the queen in there. Yeah, you want to check, make sure she's moving in the first place. So my advice is do as I say, not what's on the internet. Anyone, even you, can put something on YouTube. Well, you don't know if those people are in another country. They could be in Florida, and so the way they keep bees in Florida, it's pretty different than the way we keep bees here. So if you are going to be on the internet looking at stuff, stay on university websites and stay off Goofy, Fat Man, Beekeeper, or whatever. And one guy goes by that. He sometimes gives poor advice. So. And some people say to direct release the queen the first day you put them in. I do not recommend that. Yes, this queen has been with those bees for several days, but she's been on a truck, she's been on an airplane, she's been on a trailer, she's been over 1,000 miles, and it's just not a very natural situation, and so they really aren't used to her. And so the reason you want to put them in the hive and keep the queen caged up for a few days is so they do get used to her, and you have a whole lot better queen acceptance, which is really so important. So. And then feed, like I said. And actually, if you're starting with a new hive with new foundation, you're going to feed for a good month. So the first box, it'll take about 3 weeks for them to build all that foundation out with wax, for the queen to lay eggs, and for them to get honey stored. Because it's a pretty new population, these old bees that came with your package are going to be dying off. And so as it's, we mentioned it's 21 days till the first worker bee emerges from your brood and stuff. So your package is kind of declining. Then as you put your second box on, after this box is almost full, it'll actually go faster because your hive will have a whole lot more bees by then. But you'll still want to feed until that second box is built out. So did someone have a question over here? Did you have a question? Uh-huh.
So, aside from the honeybees, I actually have not put them out yet, but I actually have houses for non-hive bees.
Mm-hmm.
And do they bother one another?
They
Do they be a certain...
No, other pollinators, any plants that you're planting for butterflies, for hummingbirds, for all those other millions of kinds of bumblebees or different wasps that are pollinators. All of those are enhanced by what you're planting for honeybees is also going to help all those other insects and stuff. So, good question. Yes.
Do you have problems with wasps getting in, like we have hummingbees breeders, and we have trouble keeping the wasps out.
Until a couple of years ago, I had never in my life heard of wasps getting in beehives, but we have actually seen it. We had a youth scholarship family that she called us one day and she said, well, there's these wasps getting in our hive, and we said, well, put your entrance reducer on the smallest, and we went over there, and it was like, oh my gosh, but it's some wasp that's actually been introduced from another country, and they're like rough on the bees. So we finally put some wet sheets over the hive to keep them cool, and put the entrance reducer on. And yeah, so. So the other thing we like to tell people to do is treat your hive for varroa mites, and we're going to talk about varroa mites. But while we're talking about package bees, there's a couple things we like to recommend. And I forgot, I had a little handout I was going to bring about this and how to install a package of bees. So if anyone would like that handout, I'd be happy to email it or mail it to you. If you'll give me your name and address at the end, I'll do that. So anyway, but there's a couple things. After your queen is out laying, but before you have sealed brood, there's a couple things. This Apiguard is a thymol treatment that you can put on, and it'll actually kill your mites, which helps them get a better start, and we really like that method. So how else can you get started in beekeeping? You can get a nuke or a baby hive from another beekeeper, and it would actually, you would get 4 or 5 frames of brood and bees and honey, and the queen is already out laying, and that's one way you can get started. And you would just, when you got home with your nuke box or whatever, you would just, so like they were saying, the church has a beehive, and this year they want to start another hive. If it lives through the winter, they could actually find the queen in the original hive, and if say there's 7 or 8 frames of brood in their original hive, they could you have to find the queen and know where she is. But they could leave the queen and 4 or 5 frames of brood in their original hive, and then take 4 or 5 frames of brood to put into the new hive, and they would just have to buy a new queen to put in there. And so that would be a whole lot less expensive than buying a package of bees. But it just depends how strong your hive is, or you've got your next door neighbor has bees and now he's gotten you excited. He might give you some brood and you just have to buy a queen. So that's another way to get started. I think everyone ought to do a cutout once that someone's bees have gone into the side of their house. It's pretty intensive to try and get those bees out, and involves a lot of manipulations. But you could do a cutout, cut the bees out. I personally like to treat that as a package of bees or a swarm, brush all the bees off, put them in a new hive, and just do away with all that brood and bees that you've cut out of the wall of someone's house. Or some people will rubber band the brood in a frame, but trying to get that out a few months later is awful, so I don't know. You can catch a swarm of bees, as I mentioned earlier, and that's a really good way to get started, a swarm of bees, free bees, so. Or try and get bees out of a bee tree, so. So early spring management. So you have a hive established, and this is next year. So you're going to want to, in March, when it starts warming up, you'll go out, check your bees, feel how heavy they are, see if there's still honey in there. And if there isn't, you've got a feeder, you put that feeder on, you feed them some sugar syrup. You'll want to clean your bottom board off. If you have any dead hives, you'll want to brush all the bees out of there, and just check to see that your queen is okay and that sort of thing. So that's kind of our early spring management for what's lived over the winter. And we try and equalize hives. I might have a hive with 2 frames of brood in it, and the one next to it has 8 frames of brood. We kind of have a rule of thumb. In April, we'll leave 3 frames of brood in the first week of April. 3 frames of brood we leave. The second week we leave 4 frames. The third week we leave 5 frames. And then we take everything else, and we might make up our winter losses with those, or that sort of thing, anything left. But there's sometimes this hive will have 2 or 3 frames, and this hive next to it will have 8 or 10 frames of brood. And so if we didn't take frames a brood from this hive, it would be really strong and it would swarm. And so beekeeping is all about having a really strong hive, but not so strong that they swarm. And it's a real fine line. We don't always get it right, so, but I think it's one of the joys of beekeeping is guessing to see if you did it right. Because when your hive swarms, there kind of goes your honey crop flying away, because you need those bees in the hive to bring the honey in. And while it's cool to see a swarm, it's also cool to have a bucket of honey. So, and then I mentioned splitting the hives like the church might do if they had extra hives. So in April, that's when the fruit trees are in bloom. As I mentioned, you want really strong hives, but you don't want them to swarm. So we typically start. Well, so our bee club has a beekeeping fun day in Lawrence every year, the Northeast Kansas Beekeepers. And Chip Taylor does a swarm demonstration every year. Every year that the swarm doesn't fly away. Was it last year or the year before? He got up there he was setting everything up, and my husband gets the swarm ready, and we all watch the swarm fly off. I don't know. We do what we call mentoring, and one night a month people come out and we go through a hive. And one day we walked out, this was 2 years ago, we walked out and a new beekeeper said, "Well, is that a swarm?" And there was a cedar tree with a humongous swarm that had come out of one of our hives. So we can't always tell, but I'd say in most of our bee yards, we have 10 to 12 hives. I'd say we can usually tell at least one hive out of that is swarmed, out of each yard. So it happens. You don't always see it. It's cool if you can see it and catch it, but sometimes we just open a hive and there'll be those swarm cells everywhere. And if the swarm cell is sealed, like they're open for quite a few days, if the swarm cell has sealed, Chip Taylor always says if it's sealed, they've already swarmed. So we just look at each other, I don't know, shake our heads. So you just try to do the best thing, but it doesn't always work, so yeah. Towards the end of May, the black locust and the clover start blooming. We try and put our honey supers on. About the middle of May, we'll put a couple supers on everything, and so that's when the early stuff is for buildup, but the honey flow starts when the black locust starts blooming. And black locust is a wonderful, wonderful honey if you're going to plant some trees, so they'll take over an area. We love black locust honey, but you can usually, the flowers are pretty delicate. They hang down in these clusters, and you can usually depend on there being a hailstorm, a windstorm, or it'll rain the whole week of black locust. That's what we always say. But man, it's good honey when you can get it, and it makes really, really pretty comb honey. So white Dutch clover in our yards on a really wet year, man, the bees will just keep working it as you mow it. It'll come back and that sort of thing. Then the yellow sweet clover and the white sweet clover, primarily around here, those really are true honey plants. And they grow up along the highway and in ditches. And that really is what we typically get most of our honey from. So I mentioned bees produce honey and propolis and pollen. And we are firm believers in using a queen excluder. And that is this piece of equipment right here, and it'll go on top of your hive body but below your honey supers. And this keeps the queen from going up and laying eggs and brood in your honey supers, because it's pretty nasty to have brood and stuff that you've taken home when you extract your honey, and I think it's worth it. Some people call them honey excluders. If you had 50 beekeepers in a room, you'd have 50 opinions on if you should use them or not. So, but we really believe in using them. So, and then how do we get the honey out? So, the honey has a layer of. Move this. The honey has a layer of beeswax covering it so that it won't drip all over the hive. And to get it off, you can either use a scraper like this, and you'll just kind of scratch. You'll have a plastic tub or something that you're scraping into. This is the biggest mess. You'll do it in your kitchen once, and then you'll never do it in your kitchen again. So you want to, we have a honey house now, but when we started, we would be out in the garage. You always want to make sure and unhook your garage door, because you think, I have this little saying of, I'll be right back. Don't ever say that, because you'll forget. You'll go in the house to go to the bathroom. You left your garage door up. You have your 5 honey supers sitting there. And when you come back out an hour later, the bees have all come in and started robbing your honey out, and you've got bees flying around everywhere. So I say unhook your garage door if you're going to extract in your garage, but you'll use your scraper to scrape it off, or there's a serrated knife, a bread knife. They also make an electric hot knife that'll cut the cappings off. You'll cut the cappings off on both sides. And then you'll put it in a machine like this. And it spins out by centrifugal force. It turns. So there's electric machines, there's hand machines, that sort of thing. But, it's pretty interesting. And then it has a spigot on the end, and you'll put a bucket with a gate on the end of that. And you can bottle out of that. So.
Spinning that thing's what grandkids are good for.
Yes, it's always good to have grandchildren to help you.
Or son-in-laws.
Yes, or somebody other than 2 70-year-old people. So, and there's different ways to remove honey from the hive. I know the first few years I just had a couple hives. I just used a bee brush and brushed them off, put them in another hive that an extra super, and keep it covered, because bees will smell it and they'll find it and they'll start robbing and that sort of thing. So, and beekeepers are always making gadgets. I always say before my husband extracts, he spends a day working on some gadget that he thought of that he needed the year before. So. And then getting ready for the next year, and towards late October when all the asters are in bloom, you'll go out, you'll check your hives, you'll make sure your queen is still in there. Are they really strong? Do you have a lot of bees in there? If they aren't, and maybe you have 2 hives, you might combine them at that time if you think maybe one's not strong enough to make it through the winter. So this is Varroa that I've mentioned a bunch of times. Varroa was brought into this country from some beekeepers who went on a trip to China, a beekeeping trip to China, and they thought they'd be really smart and bring some queens back in their pockets, even though it was illegal to bring bees in from another country. And that is how we got Varroa. It was in 1986 that these beekeepers went on this trip. And it has totally changed beekeeping, and it has... we have some different viruses that come with it, but they're actually like we get a tick on us. They're even a little bit bigger than those seed ticks. Have you got? Anyway, so imagine that on a little bee, and they feed on the adults and brood. You can see they really like the drone brood. I mentioned the drone brood is in the hive 3 days longer, so it's 24 days. So those are the females, the brown ones, and then there's white ones in there that you can't see. Inside every cell, one male is a white little tick that goes in there, varroa mite, and it'll actually mate with its sisters. They're just nasty. Anyway, so we really recommend that if you're going to have bees that you treat for varroa, because I hate when a new beekeeper comes to me and says, I lost my hive the first year, and the first thing we say is, did you treat for varroa? And they say no, and we just, okay, because it's really important. So, nasty. Yes. On our established hives, we treat in the spring and in the fall. And even, until 2 years ago, I never even thought of telling anyone to treat a package of bees, but we're just finding they're just loaded. The bees we got came out of California, so the bees had been in the almonds, and so they were coming out of really strong hives that had a lot of varroa. And so we think people should treat a package of bees and then treat again in the fall. And there's actually some, I can't remember if I put it in here, some ways you can test your hive to see if it has mites, but all your hives have mites. And I know there's a lot of people in that Midwest beekeepers group who say they're treatment-free and stuff, but I don't know. You just have so much invested, You spend $160, $150 on these bees and a couple $100 on your beehive and your equipment, and I don't know. I just think you ought to treat, so. Using chemicals, so, we never would have thought of putting chemicals inside the hive, but now there are a whole lot of treatments for varroa that are actually considered organic because they're natural, and chemicals outside the hive. Earlier today, before a lot of you were here, we talked about all the sprays that they're using now, and someone asked about flowers before. If you're going to the nursery and buying flowers, there's big signs. If there's a sign that says these plants have been treated for aphids and all that, you don't want to buy them, because that means they've been treated with neonicotinoids, and those neonicotinoids are deadly to bees and all pollinators, so to your bumblebees, to your butterflies, and everything. And what it is they've started coating these seeds with these chemicals, and so you plant them. Well, that chemical doesn't go away. It actually comes up through the nectar of the flowers and gets in the pollen and that sort of thing. And so, now they're saying those seed coatings are washing off. It's in our, it's in our water system and our soil. So you just have to be so much more careful when you're buying stuff now. But even if you're going to use herbicides, I know a lot of people who have orchards, they'll mow their orchard real good before they spray their trees so that the bees aren't underneath during the spray. Or they'll spray late in the evening when the bees are in the hive. That's another way you can deal with some of those things, because sometimes you just have to treat with chemicals. So. And why do we have bees? The value of bees to pollination. I forget what the percentage is, but like 80% of our food needs some kind of insect pollination, and so they're really important. It keeps you in tune with the environment around you. They're fascinating. So I mentioned before, nectar is the carbohydrate to the bees, and the pollen is the protein, and pollination is a product of the food gathering of the bees. And the bees have all these specialized body parts that help them with the pollination. So, what can you do? Plant flowers. And if you're interested in looking up different lists of pollinator plants, the Xerxes Society has these great lists, and Honeybee Conservancy has some great lists, and most anything they list for bees. Sometimes they'll say this helps for this insect, this whatever, and that's really important. So. And what do you do with all that honey? Well, I started with 6 hives, and Cecil and I have had as many as 250. We're down around 125 now, and we kind of like that as we get older, having a few less hives. But we make beeswax candles out of the wax we have left over. We make creamed honey, flavored creamed honey and creamed honey. I make lip balms and lotion bars and soaps. All my soaps have honey and beeswax in them. At the farmer's market, I probably sell as much soap now that I make as I do honey. So there's really a lot of different things you can do to make money off your bees besides just honey. So. A lot of people sell pollen. Now that we're seeing more insecticides in our pollen, we've quit doing that. But it's my beautiful soaps. And it just makes you so aware of what's in bloom around you and that sort of thing. So we really like that. So how do you get started? Join a beekeeping club and attend meetings, attend a beekeeping class. And of course, I've just gone over the highlights in 2 hours, but I think it kind of gives you an idea of kind of what you're in for. So ask a friend or neighbor who has bees to help you or be a mentor. There's a couple national beekeeping magazines. They're both really, really good, Bee Culture and American Bee Journal. Go to the library and get some books or videos. And again, stay off the internet except for university sites, because there's some crazy stuff out there. So anyway, what kind of questions? Oh, that's good. How far will a bee go for honey? They'll go, they say they'll go up to 3 miles, but that's pretty far. About 1.5 miles diameter, which is pretty good area they'll go. So for water, about the same. If you have a pond kind of within your mile, I think that's pretty good. A lot of people, bird baths work. Some people will just take a shallow dish, kind of when you give your dog water every day, water the bees, put a shallow dish with some rocks in it, and they'll kind of get used to coming there, put water in it so that they don't drown. That works.
We have a creek on our property, but unfortunately we have a neighbor that's polluting it. How does that water affect our bees?
She has a neighbor that is polluting their creek. What's he polluting it with?
Sewage from this septic tank.
Sewage from his septic tank?
Yeah.
Well, we have beekeepers who have those. We have a septic tank, but they have, what's that little pool? What? Yeah, they have a lagoon, and I've seen bees at that, but I don't know.
If there's a lot of rain, there's no problem.
Yeah,
But during a dry
right. Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know. A filtering system, yeah. And even your septic. I mean, we have a septic, and it's really filtered by the time it gets to the end of your yard. I mean, it's not like there's raw sewage out there, because it goes through a tank and filters through the tank and then goes through. Yeah. So, I don't know. Call the county.
I have, but they want my name and my husband won't let
Oh, won't let you. Yeah, there is that. So you can't make an anonymous phone call. So, yeah. So I would try to get them used to another place with. But yeah, if you can get them used to, like I've had people say they've put these entrance feeders on their hives and kept fresh water in those, and people have said that something like that will work. Or just keep a bucket of water. They don't always like water right next to the hive, but within about 10 feet of the hive, keep a bucket of water with rocks and keep water in there. And if right away you can get them going to that, the other becomes a non-issue. So, Any other questions? Okay, so did I, oh, yep.
We have a lot of problem with deer eating our flour. So, what is that? It's like Aragon. Is that harmful disease? Do you know?
I don't have any idea. Does it really keep them off?
The deer off? Yes, it does.
Oh, really? Huh.
Until it rains.
Until it rains. Well, do you see? Do you see bumblebees and butterflies on the floor? Then it's okay. Yeah. So. Oh, I've. No, and they stay away. Yeah. So. Okay. So did I discourage any of you? Did I encourage any of you? So anyway. It's good. It's, and I should say that, like we have, our club sponsors some youth scholarship students, so we try to tell the parents how much work. So the first 6 weeks, you're probably going to need to be out there at least once a week for an hour. So it's not a lot of time. And then after that, maybe every couple weeks for an hour. So it's not like an all-day thing with 1 or 2 hives. I mean, it's, yeah, for just a couple hives. If you had 125 hives, it would be more work, but it's on down the road, so. If you think it's going to take 2 hours, it's going to take 4 hours. And it takes time to clean an area up and get it ready, and it takes time to clean up afterwards. But it's sticky, so really don't do it in your kitchen. So, but it is nice when you extract to have everything ready, because if you can extract your honey while it's still warm, you get a whole lot more out of the soup, out of your honey supers and stuff. So. What happens if you never extract? Well, some people will actually put the honey in the freezer because the honey will granulate in there.
If you just left it alone, never bothered your hive again.
If you're going to have bees and never bother your hive, don't waste your money, because you have to be vigilant about varroa. You have to know if you have a queen. If your queen dies, your bees are going to die if they aren't able to make another queen or whatever. And especially if you have a honey excluder on, a queen excluder on, in the winter, if the bees go up above that queen excluder, the queen can't get through there, so you need to go through and take that off. Some people will freeze their honey and either extract it later or give it back to the bees in the spring instead of feeding. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, almost every farm had a beehive or two. But after we got varroa, and people they just would put a hive out for their gardens or whatever, and that was commonplace. But anymore, would you not feed your dog? No, you're going to feed your dog. So, I don't know. I just think. I just think it's here. I will say there's a lot of research. In fact, I'd say 80% of the research now, is on chemicals that are killing bees and what you can do and what you can't do. The other 80% is on Varroa, and they're trying to raise bees, develop bees that can live with Varroa so that we aren't using chemicals, but we're not there yet. Yeah. Genetic. There's a lot of testing. And there are bees so there are some queen bees that are showing promise, but none of them are 100% yet, so. Are there any animals that can affect bees? Skunks. Skunks will go up to a hive and scratch at the front, and they like to eat the bees, and so if you can keep, I didn't mention that. If you're setting up your beehives, we kind of like to put them, we've made some little hive stands that are about as high as, say, a cement block or something, so they're not sitting right on the ground. They're up 6, 8, 12 inches. So if you get your hive up a little bit, the skunk will actually have to reach up to scratch on the front, and then they'll get stung a little bit and keep them away, but they like to eat the bees. Turkeys, we've had people say turkeys will eat the bees. They're insect eaters. But my husband and I are bird watchers, so we love when we go into a bee yard. We once went into a bee yard, and there was a swarm in a tree, and there was a beautiful scarlet tanager sitting there picking the bees off. So you just have to think how you're going to look at it. You're kind of feeding nature, but anyway. So yeah, scissortail flycatchers. We've had eastern and western kingbirds in our yard eating bees. Purple martins. We have purple martins nesting some years. So, they're all insect eaters. So you're providing a little banquet for them. Mice. Yes, we're notorious for not being able to find our entrance reducers. You want to make sure and get an entrance reducer on in the fall before the mice get in the hive, so you don't block the mouse in the hive. But bees will sometimes, we've gone up in the spring and cleaned out hives, and there'll be a dead mouse in there encased in propolis that the bees have killed the mouse in there, and but yeah, mice, oh my God, they'll just chew and chew on your frames, and they'll even eat the wood frames, and they can cause some damage. So yeah, so if an entrance reducer is your friend, so yes. I have never heard of a squirrel bothering hives, because they're fruit and nut eaters. They aren't interested in insects, so. And chipmunks, I've never seen. Yeah. A deer will knock a lid off or something, and then, so we do like to keep a heavy cement block on top. And that we've had deer knock them askew, like the top box will go up to a yard, and the top box will be kind of cattywampus on there. So, but they aren't trying to eat it. It's more like they're running and they knock into it. So. The dogs, like I said, we've had dogs in our backyard, and one dog was black, and for some reason bees don't buy a black bee suit. The bees don't like black, but we had one black dog, and that dog would just make a wide berth around the beehives in the yard. So raccoons, I've never heard of raccoons bothering them. Skunks and possums. Possums I've heard. I think possums eat insects. But badgers, I don't know about badgers. So, but bats. Well, bees aren't usually flying at night when bats are out, so I don't think bats are an issue. So, but. We've had people put pictures on Facebook that they have them on, like, a picnic table or something like that. Honestly, these, even at 35 or 45 pounds, these boxes are pretty heavy. So the higher you have to lift it, the worse it is for you. So the only reason is for your comfort, you know. If you have to work your hive standing on a ladder, that's not much fun, you know. Oh, uh-huh. Yeah, a little higher, yeah. But you could, like, we've had people who have had neighbors that didn't want their neighbors to know they had bees, and they actually made like like those kind of fences you put around a dumpster sometimes where you can't see it. You can do something like that. So and that would just be like 3 or 4 gates around, and you can open a gate and get in, something like that. So anything else? Okay, well, this has been a great group, nice big group. I'm glad. That was good.